you find yourself standing outside the heavy gates of Cluny Abbey, sometime in the early 12th century. The massive stone structure looms not just as a religious institution, but as a symbol of reform, discipline, and divine order. By this time, the Cluniac order was already centuries old, founded in 910 CEN, had grown into one of the most powerful religious movements in Europe. But power did not come from war or wealth alone. It was, paradoxically, forged through the quietest of revolutions: silence, self-denial, and sexual renunciation. This was a world where men were chosen to live in total submission to a rigid monastic rule. But what did that actually mean day to day? And what did celibacy look like, not as an idea, but as a lived experience, year after year? Let's begin with the architecture. At Cluny, every detail of the environment was designed to suppress distraction and stimulate reflection. The cells were small and cold, containing little more than a wooden bench and a straw bed. Privacy was minimal. Silence was mandatory. The thick stone walls, in part, served the practical purpose of muffling any unintended sounds, including, "It must be," said those of human longing. These men were not just discouraged from sex, they were meant to forget the very idea of it. The rule of Saint Benedict, which governed life at Cluny, was clear. Monastic life required chastity, poverty, and obedience. But chastity was not just a rule, it was a battleground. Monks were encouraged to see themselves as soldiers of God, constantly at war not with invading armies, but with their own flesh. Lust was an enemy that lurked in dreams, in idle thoughts, in the body itself. And so the weapons of choice were fasting, flagellation, cold water baths, and extended vigils. Yet, for all its rigidity, the system allowed for confession. Every monk had a spiritual superior to whom he confessed his failings. These confessions were sometimes shockingly candid, painfully human. Manuscripts and monastic letters, when preserved, occasionally described nocturnal emissions, inappropriate dreams, even cases of masturbation, always with shame, but with recognition. One such letter, recorded anonymously in the Liber Penitentiae, laments, "I did not sin in act, but in thought I burned. My hands, traitorous, obeyed." Such raw self-awareness humanized these cloistered men. Even the abbots were not immune. One 11th century record accuses a high-ranking monk of inappropriate conduct with a lay brother. Though the language remains carefully vague, one might wonder, how did the Church expect this level of abstinence from fallible human beings? The answer lies in the structure of the monastery itself. The monk's entire day was controlled down to the hour. Vigils began in the early dark, often around 2 or 3 a.m., followed by chanting of the divine office, and then a cycle of manual labor, study, and prayer. There was barely time to sleep, let alone dwell on desire. Hunger and exhaustion were, in a sense, strategic. Desire withers under fatigue. Still, desire did not vanish. It morphed. It was sublimated into spiritual longing, rechanneled into artistic expressions, illuminated manuscripts, hymns, even stonework. Look closely at the margins of medieval manuscripts from Cluniac monasteries, and you'll find strange figures, acrobats, naked sinners, devils whispering into ears. These weren't random. They were visual reminders of the internal war each monk fought on, sometimes lost. Cluny's approach was unique in that it emphasized the beauty of monastic life. Unlike the more ascetic Cistercians who came later, Cluniacs allowed for some aesthetic richness in their rituals. Their churches echoed with complex Gregorian chants. The vestments were ornate, the incense thick, but even this beauty had a purpose: to elevate the soul beyond the reach of carnal temptation. As Abbot Odilo wrote, "The flesh is silenced when the soul sings." There is, however, a darker truth beneath the surface. The rigorous enforcement of celibacy sometimes led to psychological and physical breakdowns. Mental illness, likely misunderstood as demonic possession or spiritual failure, was not uncommon. One monk reportedly threw himself into a freezing river after confessing unrelenting dreams of a woman with hair like fire. Whether the woman was real or imagined, we do not know. Despite such struggles, Cluny continued to flourish. Why? Perhaps because the vow of celibacy, however impossible it may have been, offered a kind of moral power. The very difficulty of the task elevated those who pursued it. Even failure was transformed into a form of devotion. To try and fail again and again was still seen as spiritually valuable. And yet, we are left with a question. Was this system of control of bodies, of minds, truly sustainable? Could an institution built on the denial of such a fundamental human drive persist without cracking? As you listen to the echo of Gregorian chants in the cold stone halls of Cluny, the question lingers like incense in the air. The silence of Cluny Abbey was not only externally, was expected to permeate the mind, the soul, the body, but beneath that sacred hush, monks lived in constant confrontation with the most human of realities, temptation. Despite stone walls, strict rules, and rigorous schedules, the body remembers what the soul is told to forget. Medieval monastic life was a daily grind of repetition and deprivation. Fasting was common, sometimes extending for days. Physical comfort was minimal. But hunger and isolation didn't kill desire. In fact, they often sharpened it. Monks were taught to view their bodies as burdens, fleshly prisons for the soul. But the very practices meant to control the body sometimes magnified its importance. The emphasis on penance, punishment, and confession kept desire at the forefront of consciousness. They confessed everything. In some monasteries, confessions were heard daily, not just weekly. There were intricate handbooks for confessors, many of which included entire sections on sins against the flesh. One such manual, the Penitential of Burchard of Worms, catalogued over 100 specific offenses, including whether the penitent had touched himself, imagined a woman inappropriately, or, in rarer cases, had contact with another man. What's striking is not just the obsessiveness of these records, but the frequency. Even in the most disciplined abbeys, sexual transgressions were not the exception. They were the norm. Contrary to popular assumptions, most monks did not live entirely alone. Dormitories often housed dozens of men sleeping in rows of narrow beds. Proximity bred familiarity and, occasionally, attraction. Letters from visiting abbots and diocesan overseers indicate periodic investigations into inappropriate familiarity between brothers. One particularly poignant case comes from a Cluniac daughter house in Burgundy, where a novice was found in the bed of an older monk. The records do not describe what happened, only that the elder was sent to another abbey, and the novice was confined for a year of penance. Was this abuse? Was it companionship that crossed forbidden lines? The silence of the records leaves much unsaid, but what is clear is this: even within the cloistered world of Cluny, same-sex desire, whether emotional or physical, existed. It's worth noting that monastic rules often included warnings not to embrace or gaze too long upon another brother. These were not theoretical guidelines, they were responses to real behavior. In the absence of women, intimacy still found expression, even if forbidden. Confession in the medieval church was more than a ritual, it was a relationship. The confessor wielded immense influence. He heard your secrets, your dreams, your failures, and in some cases, this power could be misused. There are rare but revealing accounts of confessors who became the focus of emotional, even romantic, fixation. One monk from Cluny, known only as Brother Lambert, wrote in a surviving fragment of his journal. He spoke with such softness, not as one judging, but as a friend. I feared not his penance, but the silence after the journal was later confiscated. During an internal inquiry, nothing more is known about Brother Lambert. There is no reason to assume widespread abuse of this dynamic, but it reveals a quiet truth, even within a world built on rules and renunciation. Complex emotional bonds formed. Sometimes they blurred the line between spiritual guidance and human need. Many monks feared the night most of all. Daytime brought structure, labor, liturgy, learning, but night was when dreams came, and with them, temptation. The church taught that the devil used dreams to undermine virtue. A monk who dreamed of a woman or a man was encouraged to confess it immediately. Some even wrote their dreams down, believing transparency could prevent further sin. These dream logs became eerie records of subconscious struggles. One such entry, preserved in a 12th century notebook, reads, "The lady in red returned. I felt shame even in slumber. I woke with tears and prayed until matins." The presence of female figures in monks' dreams was so common that some abbots instituted anti-erotic routines before bed: cold water, ablutions, memorized psalms, even sleeping on the floor. The belief in nocturnal demons, succubi, and incubi offered a supernatural explanation for these dreams. But whether monks blamed demons or themselves, the result was the same: guilt, penance, and prayer. While Cluny was more isolated than many monasteries, some clergy in affiliated houses lived in towns or villages. There, the boundaries were less rigid. Priests and monks often had housekeepers, women who cooked, cleaned, and sometimes, unofficially, provided companionship. Church authorities frequently warned against such arrangements. By the 12th century, canon law explicitly forbade clergy from living alone with women. But the practice persisted. Letters between bishops often discuss the need to remove the woman from the presbytery. Did this happen at Cluny? Rarely, at least within the central abbey. But Cluniac monks posted at rural outposts sometimes maintained such arrangements. We know of one such case from 1142, where a monk stationed in Aquitaine fathered 2 children with a local woman. When discovered, he was defrocked and exiled to a mountain hermitage. The woman was quietly paid and disappeared from the record. These stories were not exceptions. They were simply inconvenient truths. The church preferred silence, especially when the breach involved birth. Despite all this, most monks did strive earnestly to live according to their vows. celibacy became more than a rule. It was an identity, a mark of spiritual authority. To be celibate was to be set apart, not merely from the laity, but from the chaos of the body. Monks were often seen as pillars of stability, even if their internal lives were turbulent. Their struggle gave them credibility. It was not perfection that made them holy, it was endurance. To fight the same battle every day, without hope of release, was a quiet heroism that the Church revered. And yet, that reverence required concealment. The stories we hear are only those that leaked through the walls, so we must ask, what became of those monks who faltered not once, but repeatedly, who loved in secret, who ached silently for something beyond prayer? Were they punished, reformed, forgotten? Or did the very walls of Cluny so thick, so silent, bear witness to more than we will ever know? The third and final chapter of our story begins not with scandal, but with silence. Its great bell tower, once one of the tallest in Europe, was torn down during the French Revolution. Only fragments of the original abbey remain today. Stone archways, scattered cloisters, a ghost of what was once the most powerful monastic institution in Christendom. But the physical decay of Cluny mirrors something else. The slow unraveling of its central ideal, the perfect celibate man. By the 11th and 12th centuries, the vow of celibacy was no longer just a spiritual matter, it was political. The Gregorian reform movement, which rose to prominence during this time, leaned heavily on the moral superiority of the celibate clergy. Monks and priests who remained unmarried were not just considered more holy, they were seen as more loyal to the Church than those with families. This shift was critical. Celibacy was now a structural advantage. A priest with no children had no heirs to pass land to. A monk with no wife couldn't be pulled into local feuds or dynastic claims. Without personal ties, clergy could be fully dedicated to the Church's growing wealth, power, and reach. And so celibacy was hardened into law. What had once been a monastic ideal became a universal requirement for all Latin Rite clergy. The First Lateran Council of 1123 banned clerical marriages outright. The Second Lateran Council of 1139 went further. It declared all clerical marriages not just forbidden, but invalid. This was a radical move. Men who had wives and children were told their families were no longer real in the eyes of the Church. But people didn't change just because the law did. Despite these reforms, priests and monks continued to have relationships, some public, many hidden. Entire communities tacitly accepted these arrangements. Housekeepers remained common well into the early modern era. In some towns, local families could even trace their lineage to a favorite priest or abbot. Letters from bishops show an ongoing struggle to police this behavior. A particularly revealing complaint from 13th century England laments that no fewer than 7 of the local clergy live with women, though none admit it under questioning. The bishop recommended transferring them to different parishes, quiet reshuffling, not a purge. This form of administrative mercy was widespread. It was easier to relocate a priest than to excommunicate him. The Church was not blind, it was pragmatic. In Cluny's later years, there are records of increasing efforts to control both behavior and reputation. Monks were forbidden from walking alone with young boys, from serving at altars in pairs, or from engaging in extended conversation with female pilgrims. The The rules grew more detailed, more suspicious, and yet, such regulations suggest the Church knew what it was fighting against, not a rare deviation, but a constant undercurrent of human desire. By the 14th century, Cluny's influence began to wane. The strict routines of monastic life no longer attracted the same devotion. Wealth, once a symbol of God's blessing, now drew criticism. New orders, like the Cistercians and Carthusians, emerged with stricter codes and simpler aesthetics. Cluny, with its grandeur and whispered hypocrisies, felt outdated. The Black Death only accelerated the decline. Entire monastic communities were wiped out. New recruits were harder to find. Discipline eroded. Reports of moral laxity increased. Some records speak openly of sexual misconduct, not in whispers, but in formal charges. By the time of the Protestant Reformation, celibacy itself became a central point of criticism. Martin Luther, a former monk, openly denounced it. He argued that forced celibacy was unnatural and dangerous, and that priests should be allowed to marry. He himself married a former nun, Katharina von Bora, setting a public example that spread rapidly through Protestant lands. Though Cluny was not the target of the Reformation directly, the ideology that had helped build celibacy as spiritual superiority was deeply wounded. The French Revolution delivered the final blow. In 1790, the abbey was nationalized, then dismantled. Stones were sold for building materials. Bells were melted. Altars destroyed. A centuries-old institution, built on silence, ended in shouts and smoke. Today, Cluny is a tourist site, a shadow of its former self. But the questions it raises remain very much alive. Was celibacy ever truly possible for the average monk? Or was it always an ideal that lived in tension with the body? Was it worth it? The men of Cluny lived lives of discipline, faith, and often struggle. They sought to be closer to God by distancing themselves from the world. Many succeeded, others failed quietly, and some, perhaps, found their own quiet truths in between. For modern historians, the details of their inner lives are hard to reconstruct. Most monks left no diaries. Confessions were not preserved. Love letters, if they existed, were destroyed. We are left with only fragments, small notes in margins, disciplinary records, reform decrees, and architectural ruins. And yet, from those ruins, a picture emerges, not of perfect saints or hypocritical sinners, but of men. Men who prayed, men who suffered, men who desired, men who sometimes broke their vows, and sometimes kept them at great personal cost. Cluny's legacy, then, is not just one of architecture or music or reform. It is a story of aspiration, the painful, beautiful, and often impossible attempt to transcend the self as you drift into sleep. Consider this: in the quiet of their stone cells, what did the monks dream of? And if they awoke in the night, with desire still burning, what did they do with it? Imagine Christianity not in marble cathedrals, but in crowded homes, not in grand robes, but in rough-spun tunics. The early church, the one that emerged in the decades after the death of Jesus, was not the hierarchical institution we know today. It was informal, fragmented, and deeply embedded in the ordinary rhythms of family life. And the earliest Christian leaders, they were often married men, in fact. For the first few centuries of Christianity, the idea of a celibate clergy was more exception than rule. The apostles themselves were not celibate. Peter, the rock on which the church would be built had a wife. We know this not from obscure texts, but from the Gospels themselves. In the Gospel of Matthew 8:14-15, Jesus heals Peter's mother-in-law, a quiet but revealing detail. So, how did we go from married apostles to celibate priests? How did the church's leadership transform from family men into solitary figures? And what happened to those who resisted this transformation? In the first few centuries of the church, bishops, deacons, and presbyters, early priests, were often chosen from among married men. Their families were seen not as liabilities, but as evidence of stability and moral integrity. A man who could manage a household, it was argued, could manage a congregation. Early Christian communities often met in house churches, literal homes, where the family of the host served as stewards of the local faith. This fusion of family and church life was practical, intimate, and deeply rooted in Jewish tradition, where rabbis and religious leaders were also expected to marry. Letters from early church fathers reflect this reality. Clement of Alexandria's 2nd century encouraged Christian husbands and wives to live chastely within marriage, but did not call for abstinence entirely. Tertullian, though more ascetic, still wrote from within a world where married clergy were the norm. It was only in the 3rd and 4th centuries that the tide began to shift. As Christianity spread across the Roman Empire, it absorbed and reacted to competing philosophies, particularly those that emphasized the corruption of the material world. Greco-Roman Stoicism, Gnostic dualism, and Neoplatonism all held that the body was a source of distraction, even sin, and so celibacy became a mark of higher spiritual attainment. Monks and hermits, living in deserts, caves, or remote monasteries, were held up as ideals. Their rejection of bodily pleasures, including sex, made them seem closer to God. Marriage, by contrast, became spiritually lesser, even if still technically permitted. This tension crept into church leadership. Council after council began to set new expectations. At the Council of Elvira in 305 CE, a decree was issued forbidding bishops, priests, and deacons from having sexual relations with their wives. Not marriage itself, but sex within marriage. This created an awkward, deeply human problem. Priests, who were still married, were now expected to live with their wives in chaste companionship. This was not an easy ask. How does one transform a marriage built on affection, intimacy, and shared life into a strictly spiritual partnership? Many simply couldn't. By the time of Pope Siricius, late 4th century, the push for complete clerical continence was official. Siricius issued letters condemning priests who continued sexual relations with their wives, calling them defiled and unfit for holy duties. But old customs die hard. Throughout the 5th and 6th centuries, records from rural parishes, particularly in Gaul, Spain, and parts of Italy, a stubborn persistence of married clergy. These priests did not flaunt their marriages, but neither did they abandon them. In one small village near what is now Avignon, a bishop wrote of a presbyter who lives with his wife discreetly and serves the altar in humility. The tone is not condemning but weary, as though the bishop knows enforcement is unlikely. Archaeological evidence supports this. Tombstones from early Christian cemeteries occasionally refer to the wife of a priest or the faithful spouse of Father Marcus. These inscriptions appear well into the 7th century. There are even hints that some clergy remarried after the death of a first wife, despite church discouragement. One record from Ravenna speaks of a deacon who wed a second time in good standing, suggesting that local practice and official doctrine were not always aligned. What of the children? The sons and daughters of early priests lived in a strange in-between. They were raised in the faith, often educated better than their peers, and sometimes followed their fathers into clerical life. In some areas, clerical dynasties emerged: fathers who were priests, sons who became bishops, grandsons who rose to archbishops. This pattern disturbed church reformers. By the 9th century, canonists increasingly viewed such dynasties as threats. The risk was clear. If clergy had heirs, they might pass church property down through family lines. Celibacy became not just a spiritual virtue, but a legal safeguard. It protected the church's growing wealth from becoming inheritance. Yet, for all the efforts to erase these family lines from official memory, glimpses remain. A 10th century manuscript from the Abbey of Fleury lists a series of priests and their familia, a term that includes wives, sons, and servants. These were not rogue actors. They were part of the system. But soon, they would no longer be welcome. By the 11th century, under the leadership of Pope Gregory VII, the Church made an aggressive move to eliminate married clergy altogether. In 1074, Gregory declared that priests who were married must either leave their wives or leave the priesthood. His reformers swept across Europe, rooting out those who refused to comply. Some priests went underground, performing duties in secret. Others moved to regions where church authority was weaker. Some resisted openly. In Milan, clergy and laity alike protested the forced separation of married priests, sparking street riots and long political disputes. But gradually, over the next century, the resistance was beaten down. By the time of the Lateran councils in the 12th century, the married priest had become a relic outlawed in the Latin Church, remembered only in records, ruins, and grave markers. Still, the questions remain. What happened to the wives who were left behind, to the children whose fathers now belonged to the Church alone, and to the men who could not forget the families they once called their own? It is one thing to forbid marriage. It is another to erase its memory. By the 11th century, the Church had begun a systematic campaign not only to end the practice of clerical marriage, but to rewrite the history of the married priest. The priests themselves were told to choose: continue your ministry or keep your wife. But behind each priest stood someone often absent from the records, a woman, and sometimes children. What became of these women, the wives of priests? How did they experience the sudden turn from partner to pariah, from spiritual companion to a liability? And how did the Church justify, enforce, and live with the consequences of pushing these women into silence? The turning point came with Pope Gregory VII's reforms, particularly his 1074 pronouncement that any priest who continued to cohabit with a wife would be invalid in his sacramental functions, not just discouraged, disqualified. The reasoning was twofold. First, theological: sexual activity, even in marriage, was seen as incompatible with sacred duties. Second, institutional: married priests could create dynasties, threaten property control, and dilute ecclesiastical authority. Gregory's followers known as the Gregorian Reformers, took this mission seriously. They sent emissaries to bishoprics across Europe, demanding oaths of celibacy and threatening excommunication for noncompliance. But the reaction was not always compliant. In places like Milan and parts of Germany, entire communities rebelled. Crowds physically resisted attempts to remove priests' wives from clerical homes. Chroniclers record instances of women being dragged out of rectories, sometimes with their children, amid protests and tears. In 1076, the Synod of Pavia declared all clerical marriages void. The term used was concubinage, deliberate downgrade. These women were not just forbidden, they were retroactively rendered illegitimate to the Church. They were now invisible. The word concubine appears frequently in church documents after the reforms, and it served a very clear purpose. Rather than acknowledging that many priests had lawful wives, sometimes married in churches, even with episcopal approval, the Church reclassified them all as concubines. This linguistic shift was powerful. It stripped these women of legitimacy without needing to address the historical fact that for centuries, priests had married openly. The use of concubine made these women morally suspect. It gave bishops justification to expel them, to deny them inheritance, and to remove their children from ecclesiastical roles. In some places, priests were ordered to publicly renounce their wives during Mass. A 12th century record from the Diocese of Cambrai recounts such a renunciation. Father Matthew stood before the altar, swore his fidelity to Holy Church, and disavowed the woman Eleanor, with whom he had lived for 20 years, and the children she bore. There was no legal appeal, no recognition of the emotional or economic consequences. Eleanor vanishes from the record. We do not know where she went. Forced separation had brutal effects. Many women were evicted from rectory homes with no compensation or protection. Some sought shelter with relatives. Others returned to towns where their presence marked them as scandalous. Their children were often barred from religious education or clerical careers. Some priests defied the rules quietly. They continued to live with their wives in secret or moved to remote parishes where oversight was limited. Others fled church authority altogether, joining breakaway movements or sympathetic monastic communities that resisted the reforms. In the Diocese of Liege, one priest refused to abandon his wife and children. He fled into the forested borderlands, taking up a quasi-hermetic life, preaching outside church control. His followers claimed his family was part of his ministry. The bishop excommunicated him, but his name lived on in local oral tradition as a married holy man. These quiet acts of resistance tell us something important. Not every priest saw celibacy as essential. Many saw their families as part of their spiritual calling, not distractions from it. Despite Gregory's harsh decrees, enforcement was spotty. Rural areas in particular often lagged behind reformist zeal. In places like Galicia, Sicily, and Eastern Europe, married clergy persisted well into the 13th and even 14th centuries. Church authorities occasionally cracked down in waves, but evidence remains baptismal records, signed by priest fathers, wills mentioning wives, burial stones marking a blessed union. These documents reveal a disconnect between church law and lived reality. Celibacy was now required, but it was not always obeyed. What emerged instead was a culture of quiet compromise. in one 12th century French parish. The bishop wrote privately to Rome, "Father Alling remains with his woman, though she no longer leaves the rear quarters. The people are content, and he has pledged to remain chaste henceforth." Such arrangements became increasingly common. She might be listed as a servant. Her children, if acknowledged, would be placed in trades or sent away. This was not ideal for anyone, but it allowed the system to continue without open rebellion. Perhaps the most haunting legacy of this era is the absence of remembrance. Clerical tombs in cathedrals list titles, deeds, and sometimes pious virtues, but they almost never mention wives. The priest's family life, if it existed, was scrubbed clean. We must imagine a different kind of grief. A widow who cannot weep at the altar. Children who cannot claim their father's name. A man who says Mass each day, having severed the most intimate bond of his life to meet the demands of a church that now called his love a sin. We do not have letters from these women, but we have traces in folk songs, in anonymous poetry, in accusations made during later. The voice may be fictional, but the pain is real. By the end of the 12th century, the Church had largely achieved its goal. In the Latin West, celibate clergy were now the norm. Priests were trained from youth, separated from family life early, and placed in institutions that reinforced celibacy as identity. But it's important to recognize what this new norm rested upon: the systematic erasure of thousands of women and children who had once been central to the Church's life. They were never excommunicated. They were simply forgotten, and yet, in that forgetting, a foundation was laid for the celibate priesthood that would dominate Western Christianity for the next 800 years. So we are left to wonder, if so many resisted, if so many suffered, why did the ideal survive? What made the institution cling so tightly to celibacy, even when reality strained under its weight? The bells that once called early Christians to prayer were often rung by married men, but by the High Middle Ages, those same bells tolled for a different kind of clergy, aloof, celibate, and firmly institutional. In this final section of our second story, we look not only at how clerical celibacy was enforced, but how it changed the very nature of the Church, reshaped its relationship with power, and distorted the memory of its own past. By examining how the Latin Church finally severed itself from the world of wives, children, and households, we confront the central tension in the story of celibacy. Was it truly about holiness or about control? In the earliest Christian communities, being a father in the Church meant something literal. Many priests had children. Many bishops were sons of clergy. It was not unusual for ecclesiastical roles to be passed through families in much the same way as trades or farms. But once celibacy was mandated, father took on a new, symbolic meaning. The priest became a spiritual patriarch, someone who gave guidance, correction, and blessing without ever engaging in the generative act of fatherhood itself. The shift was more than semantic. It was cultural. This shift created a new kind of moral authority. The priest was no longer just a teacher or healer of souls. He became a representative of a higher order of humanity, one who had risen above the distractions of marriage, family, and sexual desire. In the idealized imagination of the later medieval Church, the priest was Christ-like precisely because he abstained, he suffered in private, lived alone, and bore his burden for the sake of others. celibacy became martyrdom, without death. But behind that ideal was a very human cost. The benefits of a celibate clergy to the institutional church were profound. Without legitimate children, priests had no one to pass property to. Priestly wealth, modest or grand, returned to the bishop, the monastery, or the papacy itself. Celibacy thus protected ecclesiastical assets and created a closed economic system. A married priest had dual obligations to his family and to the church. A celibate priest had one master. This increased the church's power over its clerics, making them more responsive to discipline and less distracted by the demands of home life. Celibacy set clergy apart. It created a social and spiritual barrier between priests and ordinary people. This barrier reinforced the priest's role as a mediator between heaven and earth, someone who was not quite like everyone else. It fostered loneliness, secrecy, and, in some cases, moral hypocrisy. The priest who lived in quiet torment, fighting urges he could not share, was seen as noble. But the priest who failed was shamed, punished, or transferred quietly. The church was building its authority on a vow many could not. The Eastern Christian world chose a different path. In the Eastern Orthodox tradition and in many of the Eastern Catholic rites, still in communion with Rome, married men may become priests. Though bishops are drawn from the monastic and thus celibate ranks, the parish priest in places like Greece, Russia, or Syria might very well have a wife and children. This tradition never faded. In fact, it became a point of identity for Eastern Christians, evidence that holiness need not be rooted in abstinence. The married priest was not seen as compromised, but as complete, capable of ministering to the community precisely because he shared its joys and struggles. Rome, for its part, allowed this exception to persist, though it remains a theological and political tension to this day. The Eastern model reminds us celibacy was never inevitable. It was a choice shaped by specific concerns, enforced through power, and maintained through repetition, not an unbroken tradition from the time of Christ. Even in the West, the memory of the married clergy lingers in hints, margins, and anomalies. A stained glass window depicting a priest with a woman and child, labeled only faithful servant. A clerical will listing my beloved companion as beneficiary. With no explanation, a 15th century German priest who paid yearly compensation to the church for housing his female cook, who bore his children and was buried beside him. These remnants suggest a story that their stories, though scattered, show that resistance to clerical celibacy was not deviant, it was common. The Protestant Reformation brought the married clergy roaring back into visibility. Martin Luther's marriage to Katharina von Bora in 1525 was both a personal commitment and a theological declaration. Celibacy is not required for holiness. Dozens of Protestant reformers followed suit. At the Council of Trent, 1545 to 1563, the Church reaffirmed celibacy as mandatory for all priests. The battle lines were drawn: celibacy for Catholics, family for Protestants, and yet even after Trent's candles continued, mistresses, secret children, and hidden wives were not uncommon in Catholic regions. The ideal persisted. The reality often did not. Today, celibacy remains the official norm in the Roman Catholic priesthood, but challenges endure. In 2009, Pope Benedict XVI allowed married Anglican clergy who converted to Catholicism to retain both their ordination and their wives. In 2020, the Amazon Synod sparked debate about allowing married priests in remote regions to address severe priest shortages across Latin America, Africa, and Europe. Stories of secret families periodically emerge, often met with institutional discomfort or denial. Many priests continue to serve with deep conviction and genuine celibacy, but others struggle quietly, painfully, with a vow made in youth, tested by life. For some, celibacy is a gift, for others, a burden. The shift from married to celibate clergy reshaped the Church's identity, theology, and social structure. In secret, communities who looked the other way, and yet the traces remain, in stone, in song, in stray words scratched into margins. The married priest never fully disappeared. He simply became a ghost one whose presence still haunts the Church's halls. So, as we leave this story, let us ask if celibacy was born from a desire for purity, but sustained by the machinery of control. Can it still serve a spiritual purpose in a world that no longer fears the body? And will the Church, in time, once again make room for the love it once cast into the shadows? In medieval Europe, the Church taught that physical separation was the path to spiritual purity. Men and women, especially those in religious life, were to be housed apart, guarded from one another and from themselves. The line between monastic male and female life was far more porous than official rules admitted. Many convents and monasteries were built close to one another. Some were even double monasteries, shared religious communities, where monks and nuns lived on separate sides of a central church, governed either by a male abbot or a powerful abbess. These arrangements were often made for practical reasons: shared resources, protection, access to the sacraments. But they also created a persistent problem for church authorities. How do you control desire when men and women live next door to one another, sharing prayers, routines, and sometimes far more than that? This story begins not with scandal, but with structure, how the architecture and rules of religious life were built to control human proximity, and how those very structures were sometimes the first to crack in the early medieval period, particularly from the 7th to 9th centuries, were surprisingly common, found mostly in Anglo-Saxon England, Frankish Gaul, and parts of Italy, but shared a single spiritual rhythm. Famous examples include Whitby Abbey, founded by St. Hilda in 657 CE, where monks and nuns lived under the authority of an abbess, Firmitiers in Merovingian France, another double monastery with royal patronage and mixed-gender liturgical life, Barking Abbey, which maintained male priests to say Mass for the enclosed nuns. In many cases, the abbess ruled both men and women, a remarkable inversion of later medieval hierarchies. These early abbesses were powerful spiritual leaders and political figures. Model worked well. Male and female religious were seen as complementary partners in the pursuit of sanctity. There was no assumption that proximity meant sin. Shared prayer, even shared governance, was part of the vision. But in time, that vision changed as the church grew more hierarchical and male-dominated. Double monasteries came under scrutiny. Reformers in the 9th and 10th centuries began to express concern that mixed communities provided too many opportunities for temptation. Canon law increasingly emphasized enclosure for women, that is, total seclusion from the outside world. Inquiries into familiarity between monks and nuns, some are vague, others explicit. A 10th century report from a Frankish abbey accuses several monks of visiting the women's cloister after Compline. Another, from Canterbury, describes a scandal in which a nun became pregnant, though no name is given, and the father is referred to only as a brother in error. Some of these cases likely involved coercion or abuse. Others may have been emotional bonds that developed through spiritual closeness, joint study, shared music, private confession. Either way, the Church responded by tightening the walls. By the 12th century, new rules were issued requiring that nuns be enclosed in convents with no access to male clergy outside supervised interactions. Priests saying Mass for nuns be physically separated, sometimes by grills, curtains, or even stone walls. Monasteries and convents that were too close together be dissolved, was now a threat to female purity. The architecture of late medieval nunneries reflected this new moral panic. In many convents, the nuns' chapel was separated from the sanctuary by a grilla metal or wooden lattice that allowed the nuns to see the altar but not be seen themselves. Some were required to wear veils, even inside the chapel, a man to sin, and vice versa. Yet, even with these barriers, interaction was necessary. Nuns needed priests for Mass, confession, spiritual guidance, and sacraments. In practice, this meant regular visits from male clergy, and once inside the cloister walls, what was to stop a glance, a whisper, or more? A 13th century visitation report from a Benedictine convent in Germany noted that the chaplain lingered in the vestry longer than necessary. No formal charge was brought, but the priest was reassigned. The report ends simply: better to remove doubt than to deny sin. Despite the rules, relationships still formed. Some were spiritual friendships, rich with devotional language and shared mystical longing. Companion, the monk Volm. While there is no evidence of impropriety, the tone suggests deep emotional entanglement. You are the soul's light when darkness presses. I tremble when I am not near your words. Other letters from less famous nuns show more ambiguous dynamics. In one, a nun writes to a former chaplain, "Your absence leaves a silence no psalm can fill." Such letters were often destroyed. Those that survive are anomalies forgotten in archives, preserved in marginalia, or mistranslated for centuries. But their existence tells us that emotional intimacy between monks and nuns was both real and risky, though rare. Some scandals were. A nunnery in Avignon was investigated after 5 sisters became pregnant over a period of 3 years. The chaplain denied involvement, blaming devilish deception. The bishop ordered the nuns transferred to different convents scattered, silent, forgotten. Letters were intercepted, and the friar was excommunicated. Agnes was confined for life in a single room of the convent, her only human contact, for even stricter enclosure. Yet they revealed the fragility of the system. Walls could be built high, grills could be forged tight. In religious life was so carefully guarded. Could it be that the longing for connection, for voice, for presence, for human warmth was not a flaw in the system, but the human truth the system could never erase? Even the thickest cloister walls could not block the human need for connection. in the shadow of stone and scripture, a softer world of longing, affection, and emotional intimacy quietly thrived, while the Church worked hard to contain and control interactions between monks and nuns, between priests and enclosed sisters. The truth was more complicated. Within these strict boundaries, a subtle form of closeness developed, one that blurred the lines between spiritual mentorship, emotional intimacy, and sometimes romantic or sexual relationships. This section explores those quiet bonds, often left unspoken or half-hidden. Were they expressions of divine yearning? In medieval monastic and convent life, spiritual friendship became an accepted, sometimes even praised form of emotional closeness. A spiritual friend could inspire holiness, was viewed with suspicion. Yet many monks and nuns wrote about their spiritual companions with profound, might easily interpret as romantic. Take the 12th century correspondence between Hilosé and Peter Abelard. Their story is famous for its scandalar, passionate affair between a scholar and his brilliant student. Continued. Her honesty makes many later letters between male and female religious seem, by contrast, carefully coded. The sacrament of confession created a sanctioned space for emotional vulnerability. Between clergy and nuns, a priest was often the only man allowed regular, private contact with a convent's inhabitants. He heard their sins, offered guidance, and sometimes formed deep bonds with those he counseled. These relationships were rarely written down, but they appear tangentially in visitation records, spiritual treatises, and sometimes, in disciplinary cases. In one 14th century German nunnery, a confessor was removed after it was discovered that he had begun visiting outside of assigned hours. The report is vague. No impropriety is stated, but his removal speaks volumes. In other cases, nuns themselves expressed the tension of the confessor relationship. One anonymous letter, likely from a 13th century nun in Normandy, reads, "I do not sin in thought when I see him, only in comfort. He listens longer than others, and I speak more freely than I should." This confession hints at the blurred line between pastoral care and emotional dependency, a line many walked with difficulty. Some of the most intense language between nuns and the divine comes from female mystics, who described their love for Christ in terms that were deeply sensual. Saint Catherine of Siena wrote of mystical marriage with Jesus. Hadwich of Brabant composed ecstatic poetry describing union with the divine that reads like romantic verse. Met of Magdeburg wrote, "I cannot dance, O Lord, unless you lead me. If you want me to leap with abandon, you must intone the song." These texts were deeply orthodox and deeply personal. In their descriptions of divine love, they often mirrored the longing and language found in romantic human relationships. The Church accepted such writings, but only when carefully framed. When mystical passion was directed at God, it was praised. When it drifted toward another person, it was punished. Not all bonds stayed within the boundaries of spiritual friendship. In multiple historical records, we find nuns bearing children, monasteries accused of harboring pregnant sisters, and letters referencing secret departures from convent life. These are rare but telling. In 15th century Spain, an abbess was deposed after it was discovered she had hidden the pregnancy of one of her nuns. The investigation noted that a visiting confessor had been too familiar and had not returned. Since the nun was quietly moved to another community, more dramatic is the case of Sister Benedetta Carlini, abbess of a convent in Pescia, Italy, in the early 17th century. Benedetta claimed to receive visions and was celebrated as a mystic. But after a prolonged investigation, it was revealed that she had engaged in a long-term sexual relationship with another nun, under the guise of possession by a male angel. Her case reveals the extremes of repression and invention required to sustain forbidden intimacy within the cloister. Benedetta was deposed and confined. Her partner was never officially named, despite official policies of separation and suspicion. Many convents relied on long-term relationships with nearby monasteries or male clergy. Priests were needed for mass, confession, and spiritual guidance. Monks often served as confessors, preachers, and even teachers for nuns. Double monasteries, though officially discouraged by the late Middle Ages, still existed in practice in various forms. The system thus relied on proximity, even as it feared the consequences of it, in a sense. Church policy created the very conditions it sought to avoid: enforced isolation paired with necessary contact, strict rules paired with human need. The result was a patchwork of lived experience. Some nuns lived in total seclusion. Others found quiet, emotional, or even physical intimacy within the cloister's walls. Most fell somewhere in between, navigating the tension between discipline and desire as best they could. So we are left to ask, if the Church insisted on perfect chastity, but built systems that required intimate interaction, if it punished women for desiring connection, but demanded they depend on men for spiritual life, was the ideal ever really possible? Or was it always a carefully constructed illusion, one that required silence, sacrifice, and sometimes secrets? For centuries, cloister walls were built to protect women from the world, to protect men from temptation, to protect the Church from scandal. But walls are never just physical. They are also social, emotional, spiritual. And as we've seen, even the most fortified institutions of enclosure could not fully contain the human need for connection, tenderness, or touch. In this final section, we explore how convents and monasteries, particularly those built side by side or closely affiliated, struggled, adapted, and eventually evolved. And we asked the larger question: what do these stories tell us about the broader tension between ideals and humanity in church history? By the 15th century, papal and monastic reformers grew more aggressive in enforcing the clausure, the strict rule of enclosure for women religious. The Council of Trent, 1545 to 1563, formally mandated full enclosure for all nuns in active orders. This meant no unsupervised contact with the outside world, no communication with monks or male clergy except through authorized channels, no external education, teaching, or nursing beyond the convent walls unless granted rare episcopal permission. The logic was clear: complete seclusion would prevent temptation, protect virtue, and reinforce the Church's authority over women's bodies and souls. But the reforms had unintended consequences. Convents became prisons for the poor and for noble daughters alike. Wealthy families used them to sequester unmarried daughters and avoid the expense of dowries. Poor girls were placed there by local parishes or landlords as acts of charity. In many cases, these women had no religious vocation. Their entry into religious life was forced, not chosen. and once inside, the walls closed behind them. One Venetian nun, writing anonymously in the early 17th century, described her convent as a tomb I entered alive. Her letter, smuggled to a cousin, pleads, "I know not God, only silence. Tell me, does the sea still sound in the streets?" Despite strict enforcement, nuns found ways to resist, not through rebellion, but through creativity. Some formed underground correspondence networks, passing letters to family members and sympathetic priests. Others maintained relationships with nearby monks under the guise of spiritual guidance, often blurring the line between pastoral care and emotional dependency. In more than a few cases, nuns staged symbolic rituals of marriage to Christ, which were deeply sincere, but also provided a sanctioned outlet for erotic and emotional longing. And sometimes, resistance took the form of refusing to be erased. In Spain, the nuns of the Convent of Las Descalzas, Reales, wrote and published poetry with longing, spiritual passion, and intellectual defiance. They lived enclosed, but their voices traveled. One nun, Sister Juana Inés de la Cruz, in colonial Mexico, became one of the most celebrated writers of the Spanish Golden Age. Though cloistered, she dared to debate bishops, write theology, and pen passionate poetry that veiled its boldness in mysticism. "I die because I do not die," she wrote, describing not despair, but the agony of desiring union with God, with meaning, with something beyond the silence. By the 18th and 19th centuries, Europe began to turn away from the monastic ideal. Enlightenment thinkers ridiculed cloistered life as superstition. Revolutions targeted convents and monasteries as symbols of corruption and repression. During the French Revolution, hundreds of convents were dissolved. Nuns were forced into the streets. Some rejoiced, many mourned. All were displaced in the wake of Napoleon and later liberal reforms across Europe. State authorities gradually curtailed religious orders. Convents that had stood for centuries were emptied, their libraries burned, their art looted, their sisters returned to a world they had long since left behind. Some nuns adapted, becoming active sisters who engaged in teaching, nursing, and social work. These new orders allowed more freedom of movement and interaction with the world. Yet even into the 20th century, the Church maintained strict separation in many communities, reinforcing the idea that holiness required distance, but distance was no longer seen as virtue by all. Looking back, what do these centuries of proximity, separation, longing, and loss reveal? First, that cloistered life was never as sealed as it seemed. Behind the silence were stories, some joyful, some sorrowful, some scandalous. Nuns who fell in love with confessors, monks who longed for companionship, quiet acts of rebellion, letters, glances, friendships that resisted total isolation. Second, that women in the Church were never truly passive. They navigated, shaped, and sometimes subverted the system around them. From abbesses who ruled double monasteries to mystics who redefined the language of divine love, their impact was profound. Third, that the Church's efforts to enforce celibacy and control desire often created more complexity than clarity. Rules multiplied, but desire remained redirected, disguised, or denied, but never destroyed. Finally, these stories remind us that faith is lived in bodies, in space, and in time. No rule, however strict, can erase that truth. The human spirit, especially when enclosed, often finds a way to speak. The nun behind the grill, the monk lingering too long at the cloister door, the confessor and penitent, bound by silence and proximity, the letters that passed through cracks in stone, the prayers whispered with longing, the hands that never touched but trembled in passing. These are the stories we were not meant to know, but they survive in fragments, in footnotes, in forgotten margins of illuminated manuscripts. So, as we leave this chapter behind, we ask if the Church built walls to protect sanctity, but those very walls trapped longing inside. Were they ever walls of safety? Or were they monuments to a dream that never truly matched the shape of human hearts? You are standing in the Vatican not as it is today, a bastion of spiritual leadership, but as it once was in the 15th century, a palace of intrigue, nepotism, ambition, and whispered scandal. The Holy See, the seat of St. Peter, had become the center of an empire not only of souls, but of flesh. The Renaissance papacy, particularly in the late 15th century, was marked by an extraordinary contradiction. On the one hand, the Pope was the vicar of Christ on earth, guardian of spiritual discipline, and chief promoter of clerical celibacy. On the other, he was often a political warlord, head of armies, broker of marriages, and, not uncommonly, a father in the literal sense. This section begins our look into one of the most notorious chapters in church history, the private lives of popes, the women they loved, the children they sired, and the complex web of power, sex, and sanctity that defined the era of the Borgias. But before we meet Rodrigo Borgilator, Pope Alexander VI, we must understand the world he entered, a world in which the Pope's bedroom was as politically charged as his throne. The idea of a celibate pope seems obvious today, but it wasn't always so. In the early church, there was no formal requirement for papal celibacy. Several popes in the first millennium were married before entering orders, and some likely had children. Over time, as celibacy became more rigorously enforced in the Latin Church, it became theoretically incompatible for a pope to be married or publicly fathered children. But enforcement lagged far behind doctrine. By the 10th century, the period known as the pornocracy, or rule of the harlots saeculum obscurum, saw a series of popes rise to power through the influence of aristocratic Roman women, notably Theodora and Marozia, whose lovers and sons became pontiffs. During this period, papal authority was deeply entwined with local noble families, and sexual scandal was neither rare nor disqualifying. Even after reforms like the Gregorian decrees of the 11th century tried to root out clerical marriage and concubinage, popes continued to have mistresses and children, often behind a veil of official silence. It is within this ambiguous framework that the Renaissance papacy flourished, and with it, the House of Borgia. Born in 1431 in Zativa, Spain, Rodrigo Lanza y Borgia was the nephew of Pope Calixtus III. From an early age, Rodrigo benefited from nepotism. His uncle elevated him to cardinal at just 25. Handsome, shrewd, and politically gifted, Rodrigo quickly gained a reputation for excess. He lived more like a prince than a priest. Despite being a cardinal, he had a long-term relationship with Vanessa de Catane, a Roman noblewoman. Together, they had at least 4 acknowledged children, including the infamous Cesare and Lucretia Borgia. Rodrigo never married Vanessa, as canon law forbade it, but he provided for her and openly claimed his children as his own defending them as my nephews, a transparent fiction used to maintain appearances. When Rodrigo was elected Pope in 1492, taking the name Alexander VI, his family did not retreat into secrecy. They moved into the Vatican. The papal court now had a papal mistress, papal children, and an ever-growing network of Borgia cousins, clients, and collaborators, all enriching themselves under the Pope's patronage. It was one of the most overt breaks with clerical celibacy in papal history. Vanazza was not Rodrigo Borgia's only partner. As Pope, Alexander VI took a new mistress, Giulia Farnese, known to many as Giulia la Bella. She was young, strikingly beautiful, and married to an influential nobleman. Her affair with the Pope was widely known and often depicted in satires, poems, and even Woodcuts. Giulia lived in the Apostolic Palace, which became the setting for lavish banquets, music, and private meetings. Papal guards protected her. Artists painted her as the Virgin Mary. Her brother, Alessandro Farnese, would later become Pope Paul III. Another example of how intimacy could become influence. The relationship with Giulia was not hidden. Foreign ambassadors wrote about her presence. In diplomatic reports, church reformers were outraged, but largely powerless to act. The Pope was, after all, above reproach, sovereign ruler in both spiritual and temporal matters, and yet the visibility of the scandal became its own kind of political liability. Perhaps most disturbing to moralists of the time was Alexander V's open favoritism toward his children. Cesare Borgia, originally destined for the church, was made cardinal at age 18, despite showing no signs of religious interest. He later resigned his ecclesiastical office to become a military commander and political assassin. Lucretia Borgia, often painted as a seductress, though recent scholarship has softened this view, was married off repeatedly to cement political alliances. Her weddings were papal affairs, with dowries paid from Vatican funds. Juan Borgia, another son, was made Duke of Gandia and lavished with titles until his mysterious murder in 1497, likely by Cesare. These children lived not as secrets, but as instruments of papal policy. He used his position not to deny their existence, but to amplify their power. This fusion of sacred office and dynastic ambition scandalized the faithful and inflamed political rivals. And yet, Alexander VI was hardly alone. His behavior, while extreme, reflected broader trends in Renaissance church politics. During the Renaissance, the papacy was not primarily seen as a spiritual office. It was a prize contested through alliances, bribes, and sometimes outright violence. The idea that popes should be paragons of virtue was often dismissed as naive. Multiple popes before and after Alexander VI had mistresses and children. Pope Innocent VIII, 1484 to 1492, fathered at least 16 illegitimate children, several of whom he openly acknowledged. Pope Julius II, successor to Alexander, had a daughter and was known for violent temper and military campaigns. Pope Paul III, Giulia Farnese's brother, elevated his teenage grandsons to cardinal, triggering outrage over cardinal nephews. What made Alexander VI stand out was not just his sexual life, but his openness. He dispensed with the pretense of spiritual austerity. His papacy was, in many ways, a royal court ruled by a man who happened to wear a mitre instead of a crown. But behind the banquets, alliances, and murders, deeper questions lurked. How could the Church claim to enforce celibacy among parish priests while its highest leader kept a household in the palace? What did it mean for the Pope, the man who claimed the seat of St. Peter, to father children in plain view? So we are left with an uneasy image: a pope in silk robes, kneeling at the altar, a mistress behind palace doors, a son preparing for war, a daughter shipped to a distant husband, and a church both glorified and corrupted in equal measure. As the incense of high mass rose into the dome of St. Peter's, so too did the question: was this truly a church guided by God, or a dynasty cloaked in holy vestments? The Vatican in the late 15th century was a paradoxical place. Beneath the soaring frescoes and solemn prayers was a network of intrigue, seduction, and survival. Nowhere was this more vividly embodied than in the Borgia family, whose lives combined papal power with dynastic ambition in ways that would scandalize Europe for centuries. In this section, we descend further into the private lives and political maneuvers of Lucretia and Cesare Borgia, the most infamous of Pope Alexander VI's children, and how their stories, both romantic and ruthless, shaped not just the Church's public image, but its internal contradictions. For these weren't merely tales of sin. They were lessons in how sexual politics, family loyalty, and ambition operated within the very center of Christian authority. Few names in church history are as loaded as Lucretia Borgia, daughter of Pope Alexander VI and Vanzade Catanei. Lucretia was born into a world where marriage was not about love, it was about alliance. Her first engagement came at age 11 to a Spanish nobleman, but it was quickly broken off when a better opportunity arose. By age 13, she was married to Giovanni Sforza, a member of a powerful Milanese family. The union was meant to secure northern Italian support for the Pope, but within 4 years, the alliance had outlived its usefulness. Alexander and Cesare pressured Giovanni to annul the marriage, claiming publicly that it had never been consummated. There is no credible evidence for these claims, but the rumors stuck. Lucretia's name became synonymous with seduction and sin, a stand-in for the perceived corruption of the entire church hierarchy. What is less often remembered is that during this annulment period, Lucretia was sent to a convent not as punishment, but as a kind of political time-out. For months, she lived among enclosed nuns in a Roman convent, surrounded by whispers about her future. It was during this time, some sources suggest, that she gave birth to a child, likely fathered by a servant or a lover, though the paternity was never confirmed. The child, known in Vatican records only as Giovanni Borgia Infans Romanus, was later adopted by Pope Alexander VI himself, further fueling speculation that the baby might be his own son or his grandson. To this day, the child's parentage remains a mystery, and in that ambiguity we glimpse a truth. The Church preferred confusion to clarity, silence to scandal, even when dealing with its highest family. Lucretia's second marriage, to Alfonso of Aragon, was intended to align the papacy with the powerful kingdom of Naples. But when Cesar's ambitions shifted toward alliance with France, Alfonso became a liability. In 1500, Alfonso was stabbed by assassins, surviving the initial attack, but dying weeks later, likely at Caesar's order. Lucretia, now a widow, was devastated. Whether she loved Alfonso or not, the message was clear. Her role was political, not personal. She was soon married off again, this time to Alfonso d'Este, heir to the Duchy of Ferrara. The East family resisted, scandalized by her reputation, but political pressure from the Pope forced the union. In Ferrara, Lucretia finally found a degree of stability. She became a respected patron of the arts, a devout Catholic, and eventually the mother of several children. Her image softened in later life, though the legends never died. Was Lucretia merely a pawn in her family's ambitions? Or was she a shrewd player, surviving in a world where women had little room to act at all? Either way, her story reveals just how tightly marriage, power, and religious authority were entwined. If Lucretia's story is one of survival, Caesar's is one of transformation. Originally placed on the path to become a cardinal and thus celibate, Cesar Borgia was made Bishop of Pamplona at age 15, Archbishop of Valencia at 17, and Cardinal by 18. He was the embodiment of papal nepotism, brilliant, ambitious, and entirely unsuited to religious life. In 1498, after the death of his brother Juan, possibly at Caesar's own hand, Cesar renounced his ecclesiastical titles. Rare and shocking, Movand began a military career. With support from the Pope, he launched a brutal campaign to conquer central Italy, creating a semi-independent state loyal to the Borgias. His tactics were ruthless. He poisoned rivals, including cardinals who opposed him. He orchestrated assassinations, often with his own hand. He employed spies, seduction, and torture as tools of statecraft. Despite his cruelty, Cesare was admired by some for his cunning. Niccolò Machiavelli, who met Cesare during a diplomatic mission, later used him as a model for the Prince figure who understood power as an end in itself. And yet, Caesar's entire career was made possible by PayPal, support funded by indulgences, enforced by excommunications, and shielded by the Vatican's prestige. It is perhaps the clearest example in church history of how celibacy at the top did not prevent corruption, it masked it. In 1503, Pope Alexander VI died possibly from poisoning, though more likely from malaria. Without the Pope's protection, Caesar's enemies moved quickly. He was arrested, exiled, and eventually died in battle in Spain, age 31. The Borgia territories collapsed. Lucretia remained in Ferrara, rebuilding her reputation. Their dynasty, once so powerful, dissolved within a generation, and yet their legacy endured, not just in scandal, but in the institutional memory of the Church. The Borgias exposed the danger of unchecked clerical power. Their lives forced later reformers to grapple with questions of corruption, sexual hypocrisy, and the gap between Christian teaching and papal behavior. They became cautionary tales. After Alexander VI's death, the Church worked hard to erase the most visible excesses of the Borgia era. His tomb was relocated, his portraits were removed, his children were cast out of polite religious memory, but the institutional structure remained. The mechanisms that had allowed the papacy to act as a family estate, complete with bedrooms, dowries, and dynastic warfare, were never fully dismantled. Later, popes continued to have mistresses, children, and private scandals. What changed was presentation. The new model of papal sanctity was shaped by contrast. Look how far we have come since the days of the Borgias. But beneath the surface, the questions lingered. Can any human institution claim spiritual authority when its leaders live like kings? Can celibacy be credible when the Church's highest example so flagrantly ignored it? So we end this chapter in the papal bedroom with more than scandal. We end with a paradox, a church that preached chastity but enabled lust, a throne built on sanctity but ruled by men with sons, swords, and secrets. And in the quiet halls of the Vatican today, amid marble and incense, does the shadow of Cesare still whisper? Or has the Church truly moved on? The stories of Pope Alexander VI, his children, Cesare and Lucretia, and their decadent reign seem almost too dramatic to be true. Yet they are thoroughly documented, recorded by ambassadors, chronicled by enemies, and whispered across Europe for centuries. In this final section of Story 4, we step back to examine the consequences of the Borgia papacy. Not just the scandal, but the legacy. How did the Church respond? What reforms followed? And how did these events reshape the relationship between celibacy, clerical authority, and public trust? Because the question is not just how far did the popes fall, but how did the Church manage to rise again? By the early 1500s, the Catholic Church faced a profound crisis, not just of doctrine, but of credibility. The spectacle of Pope Alexander VI's private life had been impossible to hide. His very public disregard for clerical celibacy, combined with his ruthless political maneuvers and nepotism, had confirmed what many already feared, that the highest office in Christendom was corrupt to its core. Even Catholic loyalists began to voice concern. Reform-minded bishops and theologians called for a return to apostolic purity. The faithful were growing disillusioned. In towns and cities, street preachers railed against the moral decay of the clergy, pointing directly at Rome. Among these voices was Girolamo Savonarola, the fiery Dominican friar from Florence, who denounced Alexander VI as a corrupt tyrant and claimed that the Church was on the brink of divine judgment. He was executed for his defiance, but he was not wrong. Only 14 years after Alexander's death in 1517, Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the church door in Wittenberg. The Protestant Reformation was not simply a response to theological disagreements. It was a rebellion against clerical abuse, financial exploitation, and sexual hypocrisy. Celibacy was a particular target. Luther himself was a former monk. He had lived under the vow of chastity and found it unbearable. His marriage to Katharina von Bora, a former nun, became both personal liberation and public protest. Luther wrote that forced celibacy was unnatural, leading to secret sin and public scandal. He argued that marriage should be open to clergy, and that the repression of desire was a source of rot, not righteousness. Protestant leaders across Europe echoed this view. The Borgia papacy became their favorite example of what went wrong when the Church tried to impose celibacy on inherently fallible humans in their eyes. Rome had become Babylon's city of lust, dressed in vestments, faced with schism, rebellion, and declining legitimacy. The Catholic Church launched its own movement of reform. The Counter-Reformation. Central to this was the Council of Trent, 1545 to 1563, which addressed, among other issues, clerical education standards of behavior for priests. The reaffirmation of celibacy as mandatory. The council did not abolish the ideal, it reclaimed it. But this time, the Church recognized that reform would require structure. New seminaries were created to train priests from childhood in the discipline of celibacy. Bishops were required to live in their dioceses. Clerical misconduct was more strictly policed. The bar for priesthood was raised, not just spiritually, but organization-ally. If the Borgia papacy had demonstrated the danger of unchecked clerical sexuality, then the Counter-Reformation sought to institutionalize chastity. Through surveillance, accountability, and formation, it was not a perfect system. But it was a deliberate move to prevent another papacy like Alexander VI's. Even as the Church reformed, it also rewrote. Pope Alexander VI's successors rarely spoke of him. His tomb was moved. His name was avoided in public ceremony. Even centuries later, historians had difficulty accessing primary documents related to his papacy. It was not excommunication, but something quieter: institutional amnesia. Lucrezia's story was rewritten in Ferrara, where she became a model duchess and patron of the arts. The child Giovanni Borgia faded into obscurity. The Vatican did not apologize. By the 17th century, Catholic art, liturgy, and religious life had undergone a kind of moral rebranding. The public image of the priesthood became one of sacrifice, discipline, and saintly celibacy. But those with access to church archives never forgot. The scandals remained buried, not erased. What the Borgia affair ultimately revealed, and what the Church still struggles with, is the persistent gap between celibacy as doctrine and celibacy as reality. Even after Trent, celibacy continued to generate scandals, often involving priests with secret families, or abuses of power. Pastoral challenges, particularly in regions with priest shortages or cultural resistance to celibacy debates, especially in modern times. Regarding whether celibacy should remain mandatory, the Church has held firm on the teaching, but the conversation never ends. Even today, ordination of formerly married Anglican clergy scandals involving priestly abuse and secret relationships each time. The name Borgia is whispered, perhaps not out loud, but in the background of the debate today. A set of frescoed rooms within the Vatican, once occupied by Pope Alexander VI, they are rarely advertised. Their door is unmarked. Few guides mention who once lived there, yet they remain beautiful, quiet, and haunted. The Vatican, now a city-state built on ceremony and pageantry, keeps these rooms preserved but contained, a relic of a time when the Pope fathered children beneath golden ceilings. In a sense, these rooms are the perfect metaphor: preserved history, carefully controlled, not celebrated, not forgotten, just managed. The story of the papal bedroom is not merely a scandal. It is a mirror held up to power, to hypocrisy, to humanity. It shows us that even in the highest places of spiritual leadership, the body remains, the desires remain. The contradictions are never fully resolved. The Borgia affair reminds us that celibacy is not just a personal vow, is a political act, one that can be used to inspire holiness or to hide ambition. And so we ask, is it possible for a human institution to demand inhuman discipline? Can a church built on grace afford no room for failure? Or does its greatest strength lie not in purity, but in its ability to face its past, however stained? It's a cold morning in rural Ireland. sometime in the late 1800s. You're walking down a dirt road toward the village chapel. Its stone bell tower rises above the hills, and beside it stands the presbytery, the priest's residence. Curtains flutter faintly in the upper windows, smoke curls from the chimney, and inside, beyond the lace-covered parlor and oil-lit study, a woman is quietly tending to the hearth. She is the priest's housekeeper, but in many parishes, everyone knows she is far more than that. This section begins our exploration of one of the most enduring and quietly tolerated features of Irish Catholic life: the unofficial domestic partnerships between priests and their housekeepers. These women cooked, cleaned, managed parish social life, and sometimes shared beds with the very men who preached chastity from the pulpit. It was not a formal arrangement. It was rarely spoken of directly, but it was widely known. A secret that was not a secret. So how did such relationships exist within a church that demanded celibacy? Why were they tolerated in Ireland perhaps more than anywhere else? And what do these respectable scandals tell us about the limits of church control and the power of community silence? In 19th century Ireland, the Catholic priest was more than a religious leader. He was often the most educated man in the community, an intermediary between the people and distant British authorities, and a local symbol of Irish identity. After Catholic emancipation in 1829, the Church gained new political and cultural authority in Irish life. Priests were now respected public figures, present at births and political rallies, but their day-to-day lives were deeply domestic. Unlike monks or bishops, parish priests did not live in cloisters or palaces. They lived among the people, in modest presbyteries, often lonely buildings, attached to the church or set back from the road. The expectations were clear. Priests were to live alone, remain celibate, and dedicate themselves entirely to their flock. But reality was more complicated. Managing a household, welcoming guests, preparing meals, handling correspondence, and caring for the sick, while tending to daily mass, baptisms, funerals, and homilies, was a full-time job. And so, almost every priest had a housekeeper. These women were almost always unmarried, often middle-aged, and frequently from local families. They were called Miss, even when well past youth. Their duties extended far beyond cleaning, ran the house, managed the social life of the parish, and sometimes functioned as wives in everything but name. Irish society in the 19th century was deeply conservative, shaped by both church doctrine and local custom. Public morality mattered. Appearances mattered. But what was unsaid often mattered more. The term housekeeper became a kind of coda word that preserved modesty while permitting flexibility. Everyone knew that some priests had intimate relationships with their housekeepers, and yet, unless a scandal erupted, nobody said it aloud. In many communities, the housekeeper was referred to as the woman of the house, the lady at the presbytery, or even, somewhat jokingly, fathers. Better half-priests were sometimes affectionately called married bachelors. Jokes circulated in Irish folk tales and country songs about the priest's back door, where the real business of the parish gets done. But this was not cynicism, it was accommodation. Rural communities understood that priests were human. They valued their leadership and respected their privacy, as long as there was no open scandal. The arrangement was seen as pragmatic, perhaps even compassionate, of course. Not all relationships remained discreet. In some parishes, children were born, unofficially adopted, or sent away. In others, jealousy, rivalry, or abuse brought private matters into public view. When these situations became too visible, bishops were forced to act. Church authorities often transferred offending priests rather than discipline them directly. Scandal was more dangerous than sin. A priest who had trouble in Kerry might reappear 6 months later in Galway with a new housekeeper and a new start. One documented case from 1876 involves a priest in County Mayo whose housekeeper gave birth. Local gossip exploded. The bishop launched an inquiry, and the priest was quietly moved to a rural parish across the county border. The woman and child disappear from the records, but for every such case that surfaced, dozens never did. It would be a mistake to see the housekeepers as mere victims or romantic partners. They occupied a complex social position, influential, indispensable, and often vulnerable. They had access to the priest's private life, were present at key moments in the parish, and often wielded quiet power over social affairs. Who was invited to dinner? Which families were favored? Which disputes were smoothed over? Parishioners sometimes feared crossing the housekeeper more than the priest, but their status was unofficial. If a new priest arrived, or a bishop disapproved, they could be dismissed overnight with no recourse. And yet, many stayed for decades. Their contributions were known locally, but never formally acknowledged. They were, in many ways, wives without vows, servants without contracts, and partners without recognition. The widespread presence of priest-housekeeper relationships in Ireland highlights a deeper truth. The rules of celibacy were enforced selectively, and sometimes not at all. Bishops knew, communities knew. The Vatican likely knew, but as long as discretion was maintained and public scandal avoided, the Church preferred not to act. In an era where priests were essential to community stability, a quiet domestic partnership was far less dangerous than a vacant pulpit. This tolerance speaks to the limits of institutional control. Celibacy may have been official doctrine, but lived reality often required compromise. And in rural Ireland, where isolation, poverty, and human need shaped daily life, that compromise often took the form of a woman in the kitchen, tending to the fire as the priest prepared his Sunday sermon. So we are left to consider, was this an open sin, a quiet kindness, or simply an Irish solution to a Roman problem? And as the bells rang out across the hills, calling parishioners to Mass, who among them truly believed that the presbytery was a house of solitude? The priest's housekeeper wasn't just a cook, cleaner, or assistant. She was often the unacknowledged partner in a life bound by contradiction, a woman living within the moral perimeter of a celibate man's home, whose presence required an entire community to pretend not to see what was plain before them. In this section, we examine the daily lives, emotional worlds, and social dynamics of these unofficial partners. Who were these women? What did their lives look like behind the presbytery door? And why did so many parishioners turn a blind eye, not out of apathy, but perhaps out of something more complex? Understanding it always begins the same way. The housekeeper opens the presbytery door to a visitor, perhaps a grieving widow, a local politician, or a bishop on tour. She offers tea, politely excuses herself, and disappears into the background. She is not formally introduced. She is not listed in parish bulletins. She is not mentioned by name in church records. Yet she is everywhere in the life of the parish, from the layout of the kitchen to the seating at dinner parties, from how the priest's vestments are kept to the tone of his letters. Her presence is imprinted across his daily routine. She is the one who wakes before him and sleeps after. She cooks for funerals, hosts visiting priests, keeps gossip out of the house, and sometimes counsels the priest himself in many cases. She is more devout than the priest, keeping the daily rhythm of rosary, mass, and novena alive within the home. And yet, her presence is always one step removed, acknowledged without recognition, necessary but never named. The emotional dynamics between priests and housekeepers varied, of course. Some relationships were purely practical, formed out of need and convenience. Others were marked by deep affection, companionship, even love. They lived together for years, sometimes decades. They celebrated holidays, mourned losses, aged side by side. The priest would grow weary in his duties. The woman would carry more of the domestic load, and the community would refer to them, quietly, as a pair. These were not necessarily romantic partnerships, though many likely were, but they were almost always intimate, emotionally, spiritually, and socially. Yet the Church gave no framework for this kind of bond. There were no vows, no protections, no confessions allowed to acknowledge it, and so the women lived with the knowledge that they were both central and invisible. One woman, writing anonymously in a letter later archived in the diocesan files of Tuhum, put it this way: "I have cooked his meals for 19 years, washed his shirts, helped write his Sunday sermons, but I may not kneel beside him when he says Mass. I sit in the back, and when people ask if I am his sister, I smile." The villagers knew, the altar boys knew, the bishop knew. And yet, Irish society in the 19th century valued discretion and deference. There was a long tradition of tolerating known button-named truths, especially when those truths served a larger good. A beloved parish priest who visited the sick, helped the poor, and protected tenants from eviction was too valuable to lose over private rumors. And the housekeeper, often seen as part of his ministry, was respected in her own right. So communities developed an unspoken code: don't ask, don't judge, don't interfere. This was not hypocrisy, it was pragmatism. In a country where Catholic identity had long been suppressed under British rule, the Church was more than religion. It was survival, stability, a source of pride. As long as the priest remained a good shepherd, the sheep would not look too closely at the arrangements of his home. Officially, bishops were to enforce celibacy strictly. Unofficially, they often practiced watchful tolerance. Unless there was scandal, violence, pregnancy, open cohabitation, they preferred to keep the system running quietly. Investigations were rare. Disciplinary action rarer still. A transfer or discreet warning was the usual remedy in his private diary. One 19th century Irish bishop wrote, "Fr. Donohue's housekeeper is long-standing. I have no cause for intervention, as the people respect him, and there is no evidence of immorality. Let them be. The Church is not served by unnecessary uproar." This was a common sentiment. Better to let things be than risk a public scandal that might damage the Church's reputation, especially in the volatile political climate of colonial Ireland. Still, the system was not foolproof. In rare but notable cases, tensions within the presbytery burst into the open often when a new housekeeper replaced an old one, or when jealousy between women led to whispered accusations. One such case in County Clare involved two sisters who alternated housekeeper duties for the same priest. A falling out led to a public dispute, and eventually both women were dismissed. The priest, aged and scandal-worn, was moved to a remote mountain parish. In another case, a priest's housekeeper was accused of influencing parish decisions, choosing which girls were admitted to the convent school, pressuring the priest to favor certain families. Parishioners petitioned the bishop. The priest refused to act. Eventually, the parish was divided, with a second priest installed nearby to diffuse the tension. These were exceptions, but they reveal that when silence broke, the community had few tools for response. Perhaps the most tragic aspect of these presuragements was their precarity. The housekeeper had no legal standing. If the priest died, she could be evicted from the presbytery within days. If a new priest arrived, she could be replaced without cause. If a scandal erupted, she could be blamed and forgotten. Some women ended their lives in poverty, living in small cottages on parish charity. Others found themselves abandoned by a church they had served for decades. And yet, despite this, many stayed, some out of devotion, some out of love, some because they had nowhere else to go in their quiet presence. We see the outline of a different kind of vow unspoken, unrecognized, but no less binding. So we ask, if the housekeeper gave her life in service to a priest who could never claim her, if she kept the faith running while hidden from the altar, if she knew the rules and chose to stay anyway, was she complicit, or was she courageous? Or perhaps, like so many women in history, was she simply living in the only space allowed her and making it her own? The presbytery doors may have closed, and the curtains may have drawn tight, but the legacy of the priest-housekeeper relationship in 19th century Ireland continues to ripple through both the historical record and collective memory. In this final section of Story 5, we explore what happened after, how these quiet relationships were remembered, how the church responded in later years, and how Ireland itself, in slowly confronting its past, has begun to reckon with the cost of silence. Because what began as a local accommodation, a whispered understanding between parish and priest, became, over time, a national pattern, shaping not just clerical life, but cultural expectations of gender, morality, and power. By the early 20th century, the priest-housekeeper arrangement had become institutionalized, though still officially unspoken. Bishops now expected priests to have housekeepers, but they also expected those women to remain discreet, unmarried, and quiet. In many dioceses, the bishop had the right to approve or veto a priest's housekeeper. The goal was to maintain appearances. If the woman was too young, too attractive, or too familiar with the priest, rumors might spread. Manuals for seminarians warned, the presence of a housekeeper is necessary, but always a risk. She must be respectable, not too close in age, and never alone with the priest after dusk. The contradiction became normalized. Priests were to live alone, but never without help. Celibacy remained a theological ideal, but enforcement focused more on public perception than private behavior. This arrangement persisted well into the 1950s and 60s, especially in rural Ireland. Many housekeepers died without recognition, buried in unmarked graves or listed in parish records as longtime servant. But some communities remembered in the oral histories recorded in counties Mayo, Kerry, and Roscommon. Elderly parishioners often recalled Father's woman with respect, even affection. She was remembered for her baking, her healing salves, her advice to young brides. Some say she knew more about the confessions of the village than the priest himself. Still, the emotional toll was heavy. Some women were said to have grown bitter in old age, especially those who had served a single priest for decades, only to be cast aside after his death. Others remained in the presbytery until their own passing, kept on by successor priests who honored the bond. Even if unofficially, in a few rare cases, death notices were printed in local papers, referring to these women as beloved friend and companion of the late Fr_, a quiet acknowledgement of a truth long lived but never stated. Priests, too, lived within this contradiction.